Imagine you are a Spanish sailor in 1595. Your ship has been at sea for months. The Pacific Ocean stretches in every direction, featureless and enormous. You have crossed the widest body of water on Earth. You are exhausted, half-starved, beginning to wonder if the islands your charts promised actually exist. And then you see it. Not land, not the green silhouette of a tropical island on the horizon. Something else. Rising from the surface of the ocean itself, not from the shore of an island, not from a beach, not from high ground, but from the water. Directly from the water. As if it grew there or was placed there by something that did not need land to build on a city. Walls of dark stone rising 30 feet from the ocean surface. Geometric corridors of black basalt cutting through shallow water. Man-made islands stretching across a lagoon in a pattern so regular, so deliberate, so obviously constructed, that for a moment you question everything you thought you knew about who lives in the Pacific Ocean. The Spanish sailors didn't know what they were looking at. Neither, it turns out, does anyone today. Nan Madol, built on a reef off the coast of a small island called Pohnpei in what is now Micronesia in the Western Pacific. 92 artificial islands, connected by a network of canals, constructed from basalt columns that weigh up to 50 tons each, covering a total area of over 100 acres in the open ocean. Here is what we know for certain. Somebody built it. It was built between approximately 1200 and 1500 AD, with some structures possibly older. The people who built it did not have metal tools. They did not have wheels. They did not have draft animals. They did not have cranes or pulleys or any of the mechanical advantages that historians of technology reach for when they try to explain how ancient people moved extremely heavy things. The basalt columns used to build Nan Madol weigh between 5 and 50 tons each. Some estimates go higher. They were quarried on the opposite side of the island and transported across open ocean to the reef site. There are an estimated 750,000 to 1 million tons of basalt on the site. Nobody knows how it was moved. Nobody knows how the foundations were laid in the open ocean. Nobody knows why it was built in the water at all, when perfectly good land existed nearby. And here is the thing that keeps me awake thinking about Nan Madol. The civilization that built it, the Saudalur dynasty that ruled Pohnpei for centuries from this impossible floating city, vanished. The city was abandoned. The canals silted up. The walls began to collapse. The jungle moved in on the artificial islands. Mangroves swallowed the basalt corridors. By the time European explorers arrived in significant numbers in the 19th century, Nan Madol was already overgrown and mysterious. The people of Pohnpei still knew it was there. They had traditions about it. But the living civilization it had housed was gone. We are left with 1,000 of the heaviest stones in the ancient Pacific, arranged in a city on the open ocean, built by people we know something but not enough about, for reasons that the historical record captures only partially, using methods that remain genuinely unexplained. This is Nan Madol, and the longer you look at it, the stranger it gets. Pohnpei is a volcanic island in the Western Pacific, part of what is now the Federated States of Micronesia. It is not large. The island itself is roughly 13 miles across, a mountainous volcanic mass rising from the deep Pacific floor to a maximum elevation of about 2,600 feet. The interior is covered in dense tropical rainforest, fed by one of the highest rainfall rates in the Pacific, sometimes exceeding 300 inches per year. The slopes are steep, the vegetation thick, the rivers numerous and fast-moving. Around the island, in a broad fringe, extends a coral reef system. Between the reef and the shore runs a lagoon, shallow and protected. A ribbon of calmer water between the open ocean beyond the reef and the volcanic slopes above. This lagoon was the highway of ancient Pohnpei. The canoes that connected different parts of the island and that connected Pohnpei to the wider web of Pacific Island communities moved through this sheltered water. On the southeastern coast of Pohnpei, where the island's mountains fall steeply to the shore and a section of the fringing reef creates a particularly large and sheltered lagoon, the ancient Sotaler rulers made their decision. They were going to build their capital in the water, not on the shore beside the water, not on the high ground overlooking the water, in the water, on the reef flat and in the shallow lagoon itself. The area they chose for Nan Madol is called Temwen Island in modern maps. Though at the time the Sotalers began building, Temwen was simply the closest point of land to the reef flat where construction would occur. The building site itself is the reef and lagoon, the marine environment, the ocean. The dimensions of the site are worth sitting with. The built area of Nan Madol covers approximately 1.5 square kilometers. This includes 92 artificial islands of varying sizes, connected by a network of tidal canals that function as streets. The entire complex is bounded on the ocean side by a massive breakwater wall of stacked basalt, which protects the interior canal network from the full force of Pacific swells. Walking through Nan Madol today, which is possible, though difficult and requires a boat to reach, means moving through a landscape that is simultaneously ancient construction and living ocean. The tidal canals still flood and drain with the tides. The basalt walls still rise from the water. Mangroves have colonized many of the artificial islands, their roots threading through the basalt foundations and accelerating the slow dissolution of the walls. The whole site smells of salt water and plant decay, and something older, something that does not have a name. The ruins are protected today as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Access is managed, though the management resources available on Pohnpei are limited and the site faces serious conservation challenges. The mangroves, the tidal action, the tropical humidity, and the simple weight of time are all working on the basalt in ways that no conservation program has yet been able to fully address. But Nan Madol is still there. The walls still stand, some of them remarkably well. The canal network is still legible. The 92 islands are still distinct. The breakwater still holds back the ocean. It is one of the most extraordinary sites in the Pacific, and it is one of the least known outside of archaeological literature. This is partly a function of its location. Pohnpei is not on the way to anywhere. It is a 5-hour flight from Honolulu to Guam, and then a further flight to Pohnpei. The island receives fewer than 5,000 visitors per year. The remoteness that preserved Nan Madol from significant outside disturbance for centuries also kept it outside the awareness of most of the world. But the site that remoteness preserved is worth the journey. It is, as the Spanish sailors who first saw it from the sea understood in their bones, even if they couldn't articulate it clearly, something that doesn't fit any category you bring with you. You look at it and the usual mental scaffolding for organizing the past fails. Not because it's supernatural, because it's evidence of something human that we don't fully understand. Let's start with the most basic problem and stay with it long enough to feel it properly. The walls of Nan Madol are built from basalt, specifically from the columnar basalt that forms naturally in many volcanic regions, where cooling lava fractures into distinctive hexagonal or polygonal columns. Pohnpei has abundant columnar basalt. The columns break from the rock face relatively cleanly, giving builders long, regular pieces of stone that stack well and create stable walls. But the columns are heavy. A basalt column of the size used at Nan Madol, roughly 5 to 6 feet long and a foot or more in diameter, weighs in the range of 5 tons. The larger pieces used in the foundations and the most substantial walls can reach 50 tons or more. Nan Madol contains an estimated 750,000 to 1 million tons of basalt. That is, between 150 million and 200 million individual moves of a 5-ton stone. If every stone weighed exactly 5 tons and was moved exactly once, of course stones were moved multiple times, were repositioned, were stacked and restacked. The actual labor involved was larger than any simple calculation suggests. But let's stay with the transport problem for a moment, because the transport problem is the one that most clearly demonstrates why Nan Madol is not simply an impressive ancient building project, but a genuine historical mystery. The primary quarry for the basalt used at Nan Madol is located at Sokei's Rock, on the opposite side of Pohnpei from the building site. Sokei's Rock is a dramatic volcanic plug, a vertical column of rock rising from the island's northern shore, and it produces the columnar basalt in exactly the sizes and shapes used throughout Nan Madol. The distance from Sokei's Rock to the Nan Madol site is approximately 25 to 30 miles by the route that a canoe would take around the island's coast. To move a 50-ton basalt column 25 miles by ocean in a culture without metal tools, without wheels, and without anything larger than a large outrigger canoe requires a solution that we have not definitively identified. Several theories have been proposed, and each has something to recommend it and something that fails to fully account for the evidence. The raft theory holds that basalt columns were floated on bamboo or wooden rafts and paddled or poled around the coast. This is physically plausible for smaller columns. The problem is buoyancy. Basalt is significantly denser than water, and a 50-ton column of basalt is not going to float on any practical raft. The smaller columns, in the 5 to 10-ton range, might be rafted with sufficient bamboo flotation, but the largest pieces at Nan Madol are 50 tons, and there is no convincing demonstration that a 50-ton basalt column can be made to float on a practical ancient raft. The canoe transport theory holds that columns were suspended between pairs of outrigger canoes and paddled around the coast. Archaeological evidence from other Pacific islands shows this technique being used for transporting large objects. Again, the physics work for smaller pieces, but become strained for the largest. The underwater drag theory holds that columns were dragged along the shallow reef flat at low tide, using ropes and human labor, without needing to float at all. This theory has some experimental support. The reef flat around Pohnpei is extensive and relatively flat, and at low tide provides a surface on which very heavy objects could theoretically be dragged. The problem is that the reef flat around Pohnpei is also covered in coral, which would have made dragging operations both slow and damaging to the reef and the stone. The local quarry theory holds that some or all of the basalt at Nan Madol was quarried from underwater deposits closer to the site, meaning the transport distance is much shorter than the Sokei's Rock origin suggests. There is some evidence of basalt formation in the lagoon area near Nan Madol, but the volume of stone at the site is so enormous, and the specific types of basalt so consistent with Sokei's rock material, that most archaeologists believe the Sokei's origin for the majority of the stone. And then there are the theories that archaeologists don't usually publish, but that the people of Pohnpei have been telling for a very long time. The traditional explanation for how the stones were moved is that the founders of Nan Madol used magic. Specifically, that a sorcerer named Olisishpa and his brother Olosopa, who are credited in Pohnpeian oral tradition with founding both the Sordeler dynasty and the construction of Nan Madol, used magical powers to fly the stones through the air to the building site. As with the angel story at Lalibela, this explanation is worth sitting with rather than dismissing. The people who lived with this construction project, who participated in it or inherited the knowledge of it, found no adequate explanation in the vocabulary of normal human labor. The flying stone story is not ignorance. It is the record of a phenomenon that exceeded the expectations of the people who experienced it. Something happened at Nan Madol that made the people who built it conclude that ordinary human effort was insufficient to account for what had been achieved. What that something was, we do not know. But we know the stones are there, every one of them, in the ocean, stacked into walls that have stood for 700 years. They got there somehow. To understand what Nan Madol was, not just as an engineering problem, but as a place, requires trying to see it as it was when it was alive. Imagine Approaching by canoe from the open ocean, sometime around 1400 AD, you have been paddling for days. You are a tribute bearer, perhaps, from another island in the Micronesian chain, coming to pay the annual tribute that the Sodalor rulers demanded from the islands they controlled. Or you are a merchant, or a relative of someone who serves in the royal compound, or a visitor from one of the outer islands, coming to witness the power of the dynasty that has held the Pacific's attention for generations. As you round the southeastern coast of Pohnpei and enter the lagoon, the outer breakwater comes into view. It is an enormous structure, a wall of stacked basalt columns rising from the water, running in a rough arc to define and protect the western edge of the city. The scale of it relative to your canoe is disorienting. These are not the walls of a building. They are the walls of a world. You paddle through a gap in the breakwater and enter the canal network. The canals are the streets of Nan Madol. They are wide enough for canoes to pass each other and deep enough to navigate at most tides. On either side of the canal, basalt walls rise to heights of 15, 20, sometimes 30 feet. The walls are dry stacked, meaning the columns are arranged without mortar, relying on their own weight and the precision of the stacking for stability. But the precision is extraordinary. The walls are plumb and regular. The column ends create a distinctive horizontal banding across the face of the stone, a visual rhythm that makes the walls look architectural in a way that purely functional structures often do not. Above the walls, you can see the tops of structures built on the artificial islands, thatched roofs, wooden superstructures on basalt foundations, the organic and perishable parts of the city that no longer exist, but that once made the stone foundations into inhabited spaces. The city is organized into two main sections. The lower city, called Madol, occupies the northern portion of the site and contains approximately 58 of the artificial islands. This area housed the ordinary functions of the capital, the residences of nobles and officials, storage facilities, workshops, and the infrastructure of daily life in a major political center. The upper city, called Madol, occupies the southern portion and contains approximately 34 islands. This is where the sacred and political functions of the Sodalor dynasty were concentrated: the royal mortuary complex, the ceremonial platforms, the sacred enclosures where the rituals that legitimized Sodalor authority were performed. At the center of Madol, stands the most impressive structure on the site, Nan Madol is the royal mortuary compound, the place where Sodalor rulers were buried and where their spirits were believed to remain accessible to the living through the proper rituals. It is a compound within a compound, an outer wall of basalt columns enclosing a large courtyard, with an inner enclosure at the center where the most sacred spaces are located. The outer walls of Nan Madol rise to approximately 25 feet. The basalt columns are stacked in a pattern that alternates horizontal and vertical orientations, a technique called header-stretcher construction that creates an interlocking structure considerably more stable than simple horizontal stacking. The corners of the enclosure are particularly well built, with careful attention to the transition between wall sections, the kind of construction detail that reveals the presence of skilled builders who understood structural principles. Inside the outer wall, the courtyard is paved with basalt. Inside the inner wall, the most sacred space of the Sodalor state, the burial vaults are cut into the basalt pavement. The burials themselves have long since been disturbed, the artifacts removed or dispersed, but the physical space of the compound remains largely intact. Standing in Nan Madol today, the walls rising around you, the light coming from directly above through the open courtyard, the sound of the ocean audible but muffled by the basalt, you have the strongest possible sense of the intention behind the construction. This was built to impress, built to intimidate, built to make the authority of the people buried here feel as permanent and immovable as the stone that surrounds their resting place. It achieves this, even in ruin, even overgrown, even with the wooden superstructures gone and the burials disturbed and the rituals that animated the space no longer practiced. The stone is still here. The intention is still legible. Whatever the Saudeleur wanted to say with this construction, they said it in a material that has lasted 700 years in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. They were heard. The Saudeleur dynasty is known to us through three sources: oral tradition recorded by anthropologists in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the physical evidence of Nan Madol itself, and limited comparative archaeological evidence from across Micronesia. It is not a lot to work from, but it is something. The oral tradition of Pohnpei describes the Saudeleur as rulers who came from outside. The founding brothers, Olisihpa and Olosopa, are described in some accounts as arriving by canoe from a distant island. In other accounts, their origin is more explicitly supernatural. What is consistent across the different versions of the founding story is that the Saudeleur were not native to Pohnpei in the same way that the common people were. They were something else. They came from somewhere else. And when they arrived, they brought with them a project of such ambition and such apparent impossibility that it transformed the island. The name Saudeleur combines the title Sau, meaning lord or ruler, with a word that scholars have various translated as meaning something like from which place or of great distance, the lords from afar. The rulers who came from somewhere else and built something that had never been seen before. The Saudeleur ruled Pohnpei for an estimated 12 to 17 generations, depending on which version of the oral tradition you follow. This translates to roughly 300 to 400 years of continuous rule, beginning sometime before 1200 AD and ending in the 1600s. During this period, the Saudeleur maintained what the oral traditions describe as an intensely centralized authority. They required the paramount chiefs of Pohnpei's 5 chiefdoms to live at Nan Madol rather than in their own territories. This is an extraordinary political move. By physically relocating the island's traditional leadership to the artificial island capital, the Saudeleur removed the most powerful potential rivals from their own power bases and kept them under constant supervision. The tribute system was equally centralizing. All significant economic activity on Pohnpei was taxed by the Saudeleur. The first fruits of the harvest, the first catch of the season, the best turtles, the best breadfruit, the most valuable exchange goods. A portion of everything produced on the island flowed to Nan Madol, where it was consumed by the royal household, redistributed through ceremonies, or stored in the substantial storage facilities that the canal network allowed. This is a form of political organization that archaeologists recognize in many complex societies around the world. What is unusual about Pohnpei is the degree to which the physical city, Nan Madol itself, was a direct instrument of political control. The chiefs who lived there were not merely supervised. They were physically contained. The canal network that made Nan Madol a wonder also made it a kind of gilded prison. The chiefs could not leave without being observed. Their movements were regulated by the tidal cycles that governed access to the canals. The Saudeleur ruler himself occupied a separate, more elevated, and more protected section of the city, physically inaccessible to the chiefs without permission. The oral traditions describe the Saudeleur as becoming increasingly tyrannical over time. The later rulers are remembered as demanding, cruel, and ultimately unable to maintain the loyalty of the people they governed. The end of the dynasty is described as a revolution from outside. A warrior named Isokelekel arrived from the island of Kozre with 333 warriors, defeated the last Saudeleur ruler, and established the new system of governance that has characterized Pohnpei ever since. The Isokelekel story is detailed and vivid in the oral tradition. He is remembered as a cultural hero, the liberator who ended the tyranny of the Saudeleur. His arrival from Kozre, his battle with the last Saudeleur, and his establishment of the non-Morki system that replaced Saudeleur rule are the most thoroughly recorded events in Pohnpeian oral history. After the defeat of the Saudeleur, Nan Madol was not entirely abandoned. The new rulers continued to use parts of the site for ceremonial purposes for some time. But the intensive occupation that had characterized the Saudeleur period ended. The city began to empty. The artificial islands, without continuous human maintenance, began to be reclaimed by the vegetation and the sea. The city did not fall. It was walked away from, and in the walking away, it became what it is now, the most mysterious ruin in the Pacific, a city that asks more questions than the people who built it left answers for. Every building needs a foundation. The foundation is the part of the structure that transfers the load of everything above it to the earth below. Without a solid foundation, the building sinks, tilts, and eventually collapses. At Nan Madol, the builders did not have earth below them. They had ocean. They had coral reef. They had tidal lagoon. They built their foundations from the same basalt they used for their walls. Enormous pieces of stone laid in the ocean, creating an artificial ground on which everything else was constructed. This is not an impossible engineering feat. Throughout history, many cultures have built structures on water by creating artificial platforms. The lake cities of Mesoamerica, the pile dwellings of ancient Switzerland, the island cities of Asia. The technique of building a platform in shallow water by piling heavy material until it rises above the waterline is ancient and globally distributed. But Nan Madol's scale makes the problem different in degree to the point of being different in kind. The average artificial island at Nan Madol is roughly 50 to 130 feet on each side, surrounded by basalt walls and filled with basalt rubble to create a raised platform. The largest islands are considerably larger. The total volume of fill material, the basalt and coral rubble that fills the cores of all 92 islands to create habitable surfaces above the waterline, is in the hundreds of thousands of tons. This fill had to be moved through the ocean to a reef site that had no road access, no port, no loading facility, in canoes, by human effort. The logistics of the operation involve a precision that is easy to overlook when you're focused on the sheer mass of material involved. The artificial islands had to be built in a specific order. The outer walls had to go in first to create a container for the fill material. The fill had to be dumped in the right places. The canals between islands had to be kept clear of debris as construction progressed around them. This required planning, detailed, specific, multi-year planning of a type that most archaeological discussions of Nan Madol underemphasize. We tend to focus on the physical challenge of moving the stone, but the organizational challenge of building a coordinated city on a reef platform, maintaining the canal network as the city grew, sequencing the construction of 92 separate islands across a period of several centuries is in many ways equally impressive. What archaeological evidence we have suggests that the site was not built all at once, which would have been organizationally impossible, but gradually, over several generations of Saudeleur rule. Different sections of the site show different construction techniques, suggesting different periods of building activity. The most sophisticated construction, notably Nan Duez and the other large ceremonial compounds in Pohnpei, appears to be the work of a period of peak Saudeleur power and ambition, probably sometime in the 13th and 14th centuries. But even allowing for gradual construction over centuries, the logistics remain daunting. There are traditional accounts on Pohnpei of the construction techniques used. These accounts describe large numbers of workers, organized by clan and supervised by specialists. They describe techniques for moving the heaviest stones using coconut frond rollers and human ropes. They describe ceremonies performed to seek divine assistance for particularly difficult operations. What these accounts do not describe, And what modern experimental archaeology has not successfully demonstrated is a technique that clearly explains how the heaviest pieces, the 50-ton foundation stones, were moved from the quarry to the site and placed in the ocean with sufficient precision to create a stable foundation. Experiments have been conducted. Researchers have attempted to move large basalt columns using only techniques available to ancient Pacific Islanders. The experiments succeed with smaller pieces. They struggle or fail with the largest. This gap between what the experiments can explain and what the site demonstrates remains open. It is one of the genuine unsolved problems of Pacific archaeology. Why build a city in the ocean when you are on an island? This is perhaps the most interesting question about Nan Madol, and it is the one that receives the least satisfying answers. The practical explanations are not unpersuasive. A city on the water is a city that is easy to defend. The only approach is by canoe, through a canal network that the rulers control. There are no roads by which an enemy can approach undetected. There is no surrounding ground that an attacker can use to establish a siege position. The water itself is an obstacle. This defensive logic makes sense for a dynasty that the oral traditions describe as controlling through intimidation and fear. A ruler who has made enemies by extracting tribute and limiting the freedom of his nobles has good reason to want a capital that is militarily defensible. The water was a moat, and the basalt walls rising from the water were battlements. But defensive logic alone does not explain the specific form that Nan Madol took. You could build a defensible island compound much more simply and with far less stone. The complexity of Nan Madol, the 92 islands, the elaborate canal network, the massive mortuary complexes, goes far beyond what defensive necessity alone would require. The cosmological explanation is more interesting. The Saudalur, like many Pacific ruling dynasties, maintained their authority not just through military force and economic control, but through their claimed relationship to the supernatural. The Saudalur were not merely political rulers. They were the keepers of divine power. The rituals performed at Nan Madol were not optional ceremonies. They were the mechanism by which the productive forces of the island were maintained. The fish in the sea, the breadfruit on the trees, the rain that fell on the taro fields. In this framework, Nan Madol was not primarily a political capital that also happened to have religious functions. It was primarily a religious site, a place where the connection between the human world and the divine world was maintained through continuous ritual. And the political capital was there because the ruler needed to be physically present at the sacred site to perform his cosmological functions. Building the sacred center in the ocean makes sense within this cosmological framework. The ocean, in Micronesian and more broadly Pacific religious thought, is not simply a body of water. It is the origin place, the place from which life came, from which the islands emerged, from which the ancestors arrived. Building the capital of a dynasty that claimed divine authority in the ocean is building it at the source of that authority. The water is not an obstacle to be overcome. It is the medium in which the sacred work is done. This interpretation is supported by the specific placement of the most sacred structures within the site. The royal mortuary compound, Nan Duis, is located at the southern end of the site, facing the open ocean. The most ritually important spaces are those most directly exposed to the ocean, rather than those most insulated from it. The ocean is not kept out of Nan Madol. It moves through it, with every tide, filling and emptying the canals, flooding and draining the foundations. The city breathes with the ocean. It is part of the ocean, not despite the ocean. This integration was chosen, not accepted. The builders could have built on higher ground, on the island itself, and avoided the ocean entirely. They chose to build in the water because the water was part of what they were building. The city is an argument about where power comes from. It comes from the ocean. The Saudalur built their throne at the source. In 1963, a geological survey team conducting a systematic magnetic survey of the Pacific Ocean around Pohnpei found something unexpected beneath the lagoon at Nan Madol. The magnetic readings in the area directly below the main ceremonial structures showed anomalies inconsistent with the known geological history of the site. The readings suggested the presence of unusually highly magnetized material, or possibly a configuration of material that was producing magnetic effects that the normal volcanic and coral geology of the reef could not account for. This discovery generated considerable scientific interest and even more unscientific speculation. The magnetic anomalies were interpreted by some researchers as evidence of a much larger and older construction beneath the visible surface ruins, a submerged foundation structure that predates the Sotalur period and might indicate that Nan Madol was built on top of an earlier and possibly even more substantial artificial platform. If this interpretation is correct, the implications are significant. A submerged platform beneath Nan Madol would suggest that construction in this location began much earlier than the 1200 AD date typically assigned to the visible ruins. It would suggest a continuous tradition of building at this site, spanning potentially thousands of years. It would mean that the ocean floor beneath the visible city is itself an artifact. The magnetic anomaly evidence is not conclusive. The readings are real, but their interpretation is contested. Normal volcanic geology can produce magnetic anomalies that look similar to the Nan Madol readings, and the area around Pohnpei has unusually complex volcanic geology that makes interpretation difficult. But the anomalies have never been fully explained, and they have not been followed up with the kind of comprehensive underwater survey that would either confirm or refute the submerged platform hypothesis. The logistics and cost of conducting systematic underwater archaeology in this remote location have prevented the definitive study that the question deserves. What lies beneath Nan Madol remains unknown. This is one of the stranger facts about one of the strangest sites in the world. The most important archaeological questions about it have not been asked yet, because asking them would require resources and technology that have not yet been applied to this particular reef in this particular part of the Pacific. In a world where archaeological investigation is limited by funding and access, the most remote sites are the least understood. Nan Madol is the most dramatic example of this principle. It is a site of genuinely world historical significance, comparable in ambition and mystery to the great monuments of the Mediterranean or Asia, sitting relatively unstudied in one of the most remote corners of the inhabited world. There is also a persistent legend among the people of Pohnpei about the foundations of Nan Madol that the magnetic anomaly evidence obliquely supports. The legend holds that the original founders of the city, Olisifpa and Olosopa, came from a place called Kanimwaiso, which some interpretations place far to the west of Pohnpei, perhaps in the direction of Southeast Asia. According to some versions of the legend, the brothers brought with them not just the knowledge to build Nan Madol, but the physical building materials themselves, transported from their distant homeland. This legend, if taken literally, describes an oceanic transport operation of staggering ambition, carrying building materials across thousands of miles of Pacific Ocean to construct a new city on a reef around an obscure island. Nobody takes this literally, but the legend preserves, in mythological form, the sense that the builders of Nan Madol had access to knowledge and resources that did not originate locally, that something came from outside, that the city was planted here rather than grown here. Whether that outside something was a distant human civilization with unusually sophisticated building techniques, a connection to older traditions of large-scale ocean construction that we have not yet identified, or something else entirely, is a question that the legend asks but does not answer. The magnetic anomalies do not answer it either. They just make the question more interesting. To understand Nan Madol in its proper context, you need to understand the Pacific Ocean as a human landscape. The Pacific is not empty. It is not, as it appears from the maps of the Western world, a featureless expanse between continents. It is a world of islands spread across an area larger than all of Earth's land masses combined, connected by the greatest tradition of maritime navigation in human history. The ancestors of the Pacific Island peoples arrived in the Pacific by boat. They came from the coast of Southeast Asia, beginning a process of island discovery and settlement that unfolded over the course of roughly 3,000 years, from approximately 3000 BC to 1200 AD. This process was not accidental drift or random wandering. It was systematic, sophisticated exploration by maritime cultures that had developed navigational techniques using stars, ocean swells, bird behavior, cloud patterns, and wind to find and reliably return to islands scattered across the world's largest ocean. The peoples of Micronesia, the region that includes Pohnpei, are among the most accomplished mariners in this tradition. Micronesian navigators, particularly those from the Caroline Islands, developed and maintained navigational knowledge that allowed them to travel thousands of miles on the open ocean without instruments, using techniques of celestial navigation and swell reading that have only recently been documented and partially reconstructed by researchers. These were not people who stayed on their islands. They were people who traveled constantly, who maintained connections across hundreds of miles of open ocean, who understood the Pacific not as a barrier, but as a road. In this context, the construction of Nan Madol needs to be understood not as an isolated local achievement, but as an expression of a Pacific-wide tradition of remarkable things. The great temple platforms of Hawaii and Tahiti and the Marquesas, the stone statues of Easter Island, the intricate road systems of Tonga, the sophisticated navigational school of Satawal in the Caroline Islands. These are all products of the same tradition of ambition and technical capability that the ocean nurtured in the people who lived on it. The Saudeleur who built Nan Madol were not outliers in the Pacific. They were, in many ways, the most extreme expression of a regional tendency toward monumental construction as a tool of political and religious power. Every complex society in the Pacific built something impressive. The Saudeleur built the most impressive thing in Micronesia, in the water, and made it last. The connections between Pohnpei and other Pacific islands were not just cultural parallels. They were actual connections, maintained by the trading canoes that moved through the Micronesian island chain. The Saudeleur tribute system extended beyond Pohnpei to include other islands in the Eastern Carolines. The city at the center of that system, Nan Madol, was the hub of a regional network. The tribute that flowed into Nan Madol from across the Carolines included not just food, but prestige goods, fine textiles, shells, carved objects, and the labor of skilled specialists from different islands. Some of the workers who built and maintained Nan Madol may have come from islands hundreds of miles away, brought to Pohnpei by the same canoe networks that carried the city's influence outward. This is important for thinking about the construction problem. The builders of Nan Madol were not just the people of Pohnpei. They were the people of a regional network, coordinated by Saudeleur authority, drawn from across the Micronesian world. The labor pool was larger than the island's population alone could provide. The knowledge pool was larger. The specialized skills required for large-scale basalt construction might have been concentrated in a particular group of specialists who traveled with their knowledge, or in a tradition maintained across multiple generations at Nan Madol itself. The ocean that seems to make Nan Madol isolated was actually its connection to a larger world. The canals were not just streets within the city. They were the last segments of routes that extended across thousands of miles of Pacific water to the other islands of Micronesia and beyond. The city in the ocean was the center of the ocean. The ocean was its infrastructure. The Saudeleur dynasty left behind almost no writing. The traditions of Micronesia were oral, not written, and the historical record of the Saudeleur period exists primarily in the stories that were still being told on Pohnpei when Western anthropologists began recording them in the 19th century, but they left behind the city. And the city, read carefully, tells us things that no document does. The size and organization of the canal network tells us about the political structure of the dynasty. Cities are organized according to the social relationships their builders inhabit. The separation of the upper city from the lower city, the distance between the royal mortuary compound and the residential areas, the placement of the chief's residences within sight of the royal compound, but clearly subordinate to it. All of this is information about how the Sauteleur organized their society. The building techniques tell us about the knowledge systems that the builders possessed. The header-stretcher construction of the largest walls is a technique that requires understanding of how stacked stones interact with each other structurally. The graded size of the foundation stones, largest at the base and smaller toward the top, shows an understanding of load distribution. The placement of the breakwater to intercept the predominant Pacific swell direction shows knowledge of how waves interact with structures. These are not accidental features. They are evidence of a tradition of construction knowledge that had been developed, tested, refined, and transmitted across generations. The Sauteleur builders were not figuring this out as they went. They were applying knowledge that existed before the building started. The materials tell us about the political economy of the dynasty. The basalt from Sokes rock, transported at enormous cost in labor and coordination, was the prestige material of Sauteleur construction. They could have used coral, which is abundant at the site and much easier to work with. They could have used wood, which is available on Pohnpei in large quantities. They chose basalt, the hardest, heaviest, most difficult material available, because the difficulty was the point. Building with basalt was a demonstration of power. Only a ruler with the authority to mobilize enormous quantities of labor could build in basalt on this scale. The choice of material was a political statement. The mortuary structures tell us about the Sauteleur conception of death and power. The largest, most carefully built, most permanent structures at Nan Madol are the tombs. The living quarters of the chiefs, the residential structures, the administrative buildings were all built in wood on basalt platforms. They are gone. Only the basalt foundations remain. But the burial compounds, Nan Duois and the other mortuary structures in Madol were built entirely in basalt, wall to wall, inside and out, because the dead Sauteleur rulers needed a house that would last forever. The Sauteleur believed that the dead remained powerful, that the spirits of deceased rulers could be consulted, could intervene in the affairs of the living, could grant or withhold the divine favor on which the island's prosperity depended. Building the tombs in the most permanent material available, building them in the ocean where the ancestors had come from, was not superstition. It was practical politics. The dead Sauteleur were still governing from their basalt houses in the ocean. You could go there. You could speak to them. You could receive their blessing. The city was not just for the living. It was for the dead. The living city floated on top of a city of the dead, and the dead city was the more important of the two. This conception of the relationship between the living and the dead, between the visible city and the invisible one it rested on, helps explain why the Sauteleur put such resources into the tombs and why the location in the ocean, closer to the origin place of the ancestors, made perfect sense. The city was an interface between this world and the other one, built in basalt, built in the ocean, built to last. Nan Madol was not the only ambitious construction project in the ancient Pacific. Understanding it in comparison to its contemporaries and regional rivals helps locate its achievement in a proper frame. The most comparable site in Micronesia is Lelu, on the island of Kosrae, the same island from which the oral tradition says Iso Kelekel came to end Sauteleur rule. Lelu is another basalt compound city, built in shallow water beside the main island, with walls and artificial islands constructed from columnar basalt in a manner strikingly similar to Nan Madol. The similarity between Leilu and Nan Madol is one of the most interesting problems in Pacific archaeology. Did the builders of Leilu learn from the builders of Nan Madol, or the reverse? Did both draw on a common tradition of basalt compound construction that originated somewhere else in the Pacific and spread to both islands? Or did both sites independently develop similar solutions to similar problems in similar environments? No definitive answer exists. The dates of the two sites overlap but do not clearly establish which came first in all its phases. The architectural similarities are substantial enough that some connection, whether of direct influence, shared tradition, or shared origin, seems likely. The existence of Leilu makes Nan Madol less anomalous. Nan Madol is not a unique, one-off achievement. It is the largest expression of a regional tradition of basalt compound construction that existed across at least two islands in the Eastern Carolines. Understanding the tradition is more important than marveling at the exception. Further afield, the Great Murray Temple platforms of Tahiti and the Society Islands represent a different architectural expression of similar political and religious ambitions. The marae are massive stone platforms, built on land, used for ceremony and political display. They are not as large as Nan Madol in total stone volume, but the largest of them, like Mahayatea on Tahiti, are impressive enough to raise similar questions about labor mobilization and social organization. The moai of Easter Island, the famous stone figures, are perhaps the most well-known example of Pacific monumental construction. Easter Island is a very different context from Micronesia, but the moai share with Nan Madol the quality of representing an ambition that apparently exceeded the practical capacity of the society that produced it. Easter Island's society collapsed, at least partially, under the burden of the ambition the moai represented. Whether a similar dynamic played any role in the end of Sawdell rule at Pohnpei is a question that archaeologists have explored without arriving at a definitive answer. The parallel with the collapse narrative at Easter Island is worth considering. The Sawdell oral tradition describes the dynasty's end as a political revolution, not a resource collapse. Iso Kelekel came from outside and defeated the last Sawdell in battle. This is the memory. But memories are not always complete. The social stresses created by the Sawdell tribute system, the demands of building and maintaining a capital of basalt in the ocean, the constraints placed on the island's traditional nobility, these are the kinds of structural pressures that create the conditions in which an outside challenger can find enough internal support to overturn an established order. The city in the ocean may have been both the Sawdell's greatest achievement and the mechanism of their destruction. The ambition that built it created the demands that made it unsustainable. The monument to permanence was the cause of impermanence. This pattern of great ambition creating the conditions for its own collapse is not unique to Nan Madol. It runs through the history of complex societies everywhere. The larger the ambition, the more fragile the system that sustains it. The Sawdell built the largest and most permanent thing in Micronesia, and then, sometime in the 1600s, they were gone. The city remained. The ambition was not. Modern archaeological work at Nan Madol has been limited by several factors that together make it one of the most studied yet poorly understood major sites in world archaeology. The first factor is access. Pohnpei is remote. Getting there requires multiple flights and significant time. The site itself is accessible only by boat, and navigating the canals and the reef requires local knowledge and appropriate equipment. Most archaeological projects at Nan Madol have been short in duration, limited by the expense and difficulty of sustained work in this location. The second factor is the environment. The site is a tropical reef system subject to tidal flooding, high humidity, biological colonization by mangroves and other vegetation, and the physical disturbance of periodic typhoon events. All of these factors damage archaeological material and make systematic excavation and analysis difficult. The site is actively deteriorating, and the resources available to address the deterioration are limited. The third factor is the nature of the material. The basalt walls and platforms of Nan Madol are abundant and well preserved compared to the organic material, the wood, the plant fiber, the thatching, the cloth, the food remains, that would tell us most about daily life in the city. Most of what the city's inhabitants actually used and consumed has long since dissolved into the tropical environment. What remains is the stone, which is informative about construction techniques and large-scale organization, but less informative about the texture of daily life. The fourth factor is the depth of underwater material. The tidal canals contain centuries of accumulated sediment that may preserve organic material and artifacts below the current surface. Systematic survey of the canal sediments has not been conducted. The magnetic anomaly evidence suggests possible structural material beneath the visible ruins. Neither the canal sediments nor the possible submerged foundations have been comprehensively investigated. What archaeology has established about Nan Madol includes the following. Construction began no earlier than approximately 1180 AD for the visible ruins, though some dating of material from the site suggests earlier activity. The most intensive construction period was the 14th century. The site was occupied until approximately the 16th or 17th century. The construction materials are predominantly basalt, with coral rubble used as fill. The diet of the occupants included marine resources, breadfruit, and taro. The population of the site at any given time was relatively small, probably in the hundreds rather than the thousands, concentrated in the upper city area near the ceremonial compounds. This last point is important. Nan Madol was not a city in the demographic sense of holding a large civilian population. It was more like a ceremonial and political capital, housing the ruler, the ruling class, the specialists and servants required to maintain the ritual functions of the state, and the paramount chiefs who were required to be resident at the capital. The common people of Pohnpei lived on the main island. They came to Nan Madol for tribute delivery, for ceremonies, for the periodic events that the Saudeleur organized to maintain their authority. But the city's permanent population was small relative to its size. This helps explain the enormous investment in construction relative to the number of people housed. The city was built not to shelter a large population, but to impress one. Every canoe approaching through the breakwater, every tribute bearer paddling through the basalt corridors, was intended to understand immediately and physically the power of the Saudeleur. The city was propaganda in basalt. That explains why the walls are so high, why the stone is so heavy, why the difficulty of the construction was accepted rather than avoided. The difficulty was the message. We built this, the walls say. We moved mountains to the ocean and stacked them 30 feet high and made an island city where no island should exist. We are the Saudeleur. We are the lords from afar. We command the stone and the sea. The message worked for 3 to 4 centuries. Then Iso-Kelekel came with 333 warriors from Khosrei, and the message was answered. Cities are usually abandoned gradually. The end of a city is rarely a single event, a fire or a flood or a conquest that leaves the ruins clean and dateable. More often it is a process, a thinning out of population, a reduction in maintenance, a gradual relaxation of the systems that kept the urban structure functional, until one day the people who remain are not maintaining a city anymore, but simply living in the ruins of one. Nan Madol's abandonment appears to have followed this pattern, though the oral tradition tends to emphasize the dramatic single event of Iso-Kelekel's victory over the last Saudeleur. After the political transition, the new rulers, operating under the non-Morki system that Iso-Kelekel established, did not entirely stop using Nan Madol. Parts of the site continued to be used for ceremonial purposes. Some of the basalt compounds in Madolpa retained their sacred character and continued to be the site of ritual activity for generations after Saudeleur rule ended. But the political function of the city was gone. The chiefs who had been required to live at Nan Madol returned to their own territories. The tribute system that had funded the city's maintenance was reorganized. The specialized workforce that had maintained the buildings, cleared the canals, and managed the complex logistics of the ocean city dispersed. Without constant maintenance, a city built in the ocean deteriorates quickly. The tidal canals, if not dredged regularly, fill with sediment. Sediment supports vegetation. Vegetation roots destabilize the basalt walls. The walls, once destabilized, collapse inward. The artificial islands, once their walls begin to fail, are colonized by mangroves, whose roots continue the work of destabilization. This process has been ongoing for approximately 400 years. The result is the Nan Madol we can visit today, a site that is simultaneously impressive and ruinous, where the scale of the original achievement is still clearly legible, but where the physical fabric is in continuous slow collapse. The mangroves are the most visible agents of this collapse. They have colonized most of the artificial islands in the lower city, their prop roots threading through the basalt rubble and their canopies shading the walls. From the air, Nan Madol looks like a forest built on a grid, the geometric canal network still visible as gaps in the vegetation, the basalt walls rising above the mangrove canopy in places, submerged beneath it in others. Walking through the site means walking through this combination of ruin and forest, through the smell of the tidal water and the darkness under the mangrove canopy, over basalt that is slippery with algae and unstable underfoot where the walls have collapsed. It is not a comfortable sight to visit, it is an uncomfortable one, and the discomfort is part of the experience. You are in a place that has been falling for 400 years and is still not finished falling. You are in a place where the ambition of the people who built it is still visible in the scale of what is collapsing. You are in a place where the ocean, which the builders chose as their medium, is slowly reclaiming what was taken from it. The basalt is going back to the water. In 10,000 years, if no one intervenes, there will be nothing left above the waterline. The reef will be flat again, covered in its original coral. The canals will be filled. The walls will be rubble beneath the surface. Nan Madol will be, as it was before the Saudeleur arrived, just a reef. The ocean has time. No account of Nan Madol is complete without the legend of the brothers who founded it. Oli Sishpa and Olo Sopa appear in the Pohnpeian oral tradition as something between historical figures and mythological beings. They are the founders of both the Saudeleur dynasty and the city of Nan Madol. Their story is the origin story of the most remarkable thing in Pohnpei's past. The versions of the legend collected by anthropologists over the past century vary in detail but share a consistent outline. The brothers came from a distant land, variously identified as a place to the southwest of Pohnpei, sometimes named as Kanimwaiso, or sometimes as a place below the horizon of the known world. They traveled by canoe across the open ocean, carrying with them both the ambition and the means to build a city. When they arrived at Pohnpei, the island was inhabited, but had no system of political authority that organized the whole island under one ruler. The brothers recognized the reef flat on the southeastern shore as the place to build. Their first attempts to establish their altar failed. They needed a specific kind of sacred foundation, a place where a certain eel god named Nanason Saf would consent to dwell, and they searched the coast of Pohnpei repeatedly, trying different locations, before they found the right spot. When they found it, they began to build. And this is where the magic enters the story. According to the legend, the brothers used magical chants to fly the massive basalt columns through the air to the building site. They would chant, and the stones would lift from the ground on the distant part of the island where they were quarried, and travel through the air and settle into place in the growing city on the reef. This is the part of the story that Western scholars have had the most difficulty with. The flying stones motif appears in many traditions around the world as an explanation for large-scale ancient construction, and it is usually interpreted as a metaphor or a mythological embellishment of an impressive but mundane human engineering achievement. But the legend insists on the flying stones with a specificity that is worth noting. It is not merely that the stones moved. It is that they moved in a specific way, through the air, guided by specific chants performed by the founders. The method matters. The magic was not general. It was a specific technique. When Olasishpa died, Olasopa became the sole ruler and continued the construction. He eventually married a Pohnpeian woman and had 12 children, and from these children descended the 17 rulers who constitute the Saudalar dynasty of historical memory. The dynasty that Olasopa founded was, according to the legend, characterized from the beginning by the divine authority the founders had brought from their distant homeland. The legitimacy of Saudalar rule rested on this divine origin. The city they built in the ocean was the physical embodiment of that divine authority. To approach Nan Madol was to approach the place where the divine founders had established their presence. The legend explains everything. It explains who built the city, how they built it, why they built it, where they did, and why the dynasty that issued from the building was legitimate. It is a complete story, satisfying in the way that origin myths are supposed to be satisfying. It is also, like all origin myths, a selective and shaped account that preserves certain kinds of truth and obscures others. What it preserves is the memory that the founders of Nan Madol were not ordinary people doing an ordinary thing. Something extraordinary happened here. Something that the normal vocabulary of human achievement could not contain. So the story reached for the only available vocabulary that could accommodate the extraordinary: magic, flying stones, divine founders. Whether you translate that into religious terms, or archaeological terms, or engineering terms, the underlying observation is the same. Something happened at Nan Madol that exceeds easy explanation. The legend has been saying this for 700 years. Nobody has yet produced a better explanation. There is something about Nan Madol that photographs do not capture and descriptions do not quite convey. Sound. Nan Madol is a city built in the ocean, and the ocean never stops speaking. The tidal water moves through the canal network constantly, the sound of it varying with the tide and the weather. A gentle lapping when the tide is slack, a stronger surge when the tidal current is running, and in typhoon weather, a roar that must have made the basalt walls tremble. The ocean is the acoustic environment of the city. You cannot hear Nan Madol without hearing water. The sound of water moving through stone corridors, rising and falling with the tide, is constant, rhythmic, inescapable. This was not an accident. The same cosmological thinking that placed the city in the ocean also placed the city's inhabitants in continuous acoustic relationship with the ocean. The water spoke in the canals, in the foundations, in the drainage channels, in the tidal pools that formed at the bases of the walls. You could hear the ocean in every room in the city. For a dynasty that claimed its authority derived from divine origins across the sea, from a distant homeland that lay beyond the ocean, this acoustic environment was a continuous reminder of source. The water that moved through the city's foundations was the same water that connected Pohnpei to the distant place of divine origin. The ocean was not just the medium in which the city was built, it was the voice of the authority on which the city rested. The priests who performed the rituals at Nan Duas would have heard the tidal water moving beneath the basalt floor as they chanted. The chiefs who lived in the canal district would have fallen asleep to the sound of the tide in the corridors outside. The workers who maintained the canals would have worked to the rhythm of the ocean that was simultaneously their workplace and their horizon. The city was scored for water. Contemporary visitors to the site report this as one of its most affecting qualities. You go to see the walls. You go to see the scale of the construction. You go prepared to think about history and archaeology and the logistics of moving basalt through the open ocean. And then you arrive and you hear the water, and the sight becomes something that thinking about doesn't fully capture. It becomes something you feel in the body, the water moving through stone, the rhythm of the tide in the ruins of the city that built itself on the ocean's consent. The Saudeleur understood that they were building in the ocean's medium. They designed their city as a partner to the water, not as a conquest of it. The canals were not obstacles to be filled in. They were the city's arteries. The tidal flow was not a problem to be solved. It was the city's heartbeat. Every city has a sound. New York has its horns and its subway rumble. Paris has its bells. Rome has its traffic and its fountains. Nan Madol has the ocean. In the ruins of the city, with the mangroves overhead and the basalt walls rising from the tidal water and the sun coming through the breaks in the canopy, the sound is still there, still moving through the stone corridors, still rising and falling with the tide, still speaking in the language of the sea. The city is abandoned. The sound remains. Here is an honest accounting of what remains genuinely unknown about Nan Madol after more than a century of archaeological attention and oral history collection. We do not know the precise transport method for the largest stones. The experimental archaeology suggests that smaller pieces could be moved by canoe or raft. The 50-ton pieces at the foundations are not explained by any technique that has been successfully demonstrated. We do not know the precise date of the site's founding. The oral tradition says the founding brothers arrived before memory. The archaeological dating suggests construction of the visible ruins began around 1180 AD, but earlier activity at the site has not been ruled out. We do not know what the magnetic anomalies beneath the site represent. The geological survey from 1,963 identified readings inconsistent with normal reef geology. No subsequent systematic underwater survey has been conducted to resolve the question. We do not know the full extent of the site. The 92 islands are well documented. The underwater structures are not. The canal sediments have not been systematically sampled. The reef flat beyond the visible ruins has not been comprehensively surveyed. We do not know the full population of the city at its peak. Estimates range from a few hundred permanent residents to several thousand. The evidence does not resolve this convincingly. We do not know the precise ritual calendar and content of the ceremonies performed at the site. Oral tradition provides some information about specific ceremonies, but the reconstruction of the full ritual program of the Saudeleur state is incomplete. We do not know what happened to the specialists who built the city, whether they formed a hereditary guild that maintained their knowledge across generations, or whether each generation of construction required recruiting new workers, or whether the knowledge was concentrated in a small group that traveled with the Saudeleur court is not established. We do not know the origin of the Saudeleur themselves with any precision. The oral tradition says they came from the southwest. Archaeological evidence supports connections between Pohnpei and other Micronesian and possibly Western Pacific islands, but the specific origin of the ruling dynasty is not established. We do not know why the builders chose basalt over the more easily available coral, beyond the general argument that basalt was a prestige material that demonstrated power. Whether there were practical engineering reasons for the choice, related to the specific structural demands of building on a reef in the open Pacific, has not been systematically examined. These are not small gaps in a largely understood story. They are fundamental questions about the basic character of the site, what it was, how it was built, and who built it. Nan Madol is, in this sense, not well understood at all. It is well described. The walls have been measured and mapped. The islands have been counted. The oral traditions have been recorded. But the central questions have not been answered. A site of this importance and this mystery deserves more attention than it has received. The Pacific hides many things in its remoteness. Nan Madol may be the most significant thing it hides. Nan Madol is on the UNESCO list of World Heritage in Danger. This designation, added in 2016, reflects the fact that the site is deteriorating faster than current resources can address. The specific threats identified by UNESCO include mangrove encroachment, which is currently the most visually obvious problem, erosion of the basalt walls from tidal action and the roots of the mangroves, lack of adequate legal and management frameworks to control land use and development in the surrounding area, and insufficient funding for conservation and maintenance work. The government of the Federated States of Micronesia and the state of Pohnpei have limited resources. Nan Madol is competing for those resources with the practical needs of a developing Pacific Island state: healthcare, education, infrastructure, economic development. The argument for diverting significant resources to the conservation of an archaeological site, however significant, is not always easy to make in that context. International support for the site's conservation has been inconsistent. Archaeological research has been conducted by institutions from Japan, the United States, and other countries over the years, but the research has been episodic rather than sustained, and the conservation work has lagged behind both the research and the deterioration. The mangroves are the most immediate problem and also the most contested. Mangroves are ecologically valuable. They provide habitat, protect coastlines, and sequester carbon. Removing them is environmentally costly and logistically difficult, but the mangroves at Nan Madol are slowly destroying the walls and islands they have colonized. Every root system that finds its way into the basalt rubble is a lever that, over decades, will pry the stones apart. A comprehensive mangrove removal and wall stabilization program has been discussed for years but has not been fully implemented. The cost estimates are significant. The political and environmental complexities are real. Meanwhile, the walls continue to collapse. The parallel with the broader challenge of preserving Pacific cultural heritage is exact. The material culture of the Pacific island world is disappearing at a rate that institutional resources cannot address. The canoe-building traditions, the navigation knowledge, the weaving and carving skills, the oral literature, all of these are under the same kind of pressure as the basalt walls of Nan Madol, the pressure of time and change and insufficient investment in preservation. Nan Madol is the most dramatic physical symbol of this broader loss. The most impressive architectural achievement in the history of Micronesia is slowly returning to the ocean that it was built in. There is a way of seeing this that is not entirely tragic. The Saudeleurs built in the ocean, knowing that the ocean would eventually reclaim what they built. The impermanence was part of the design. A city built to house the ancestors in the realm of the dead was already in conversation with dissolution. The ocean had been there before, it would be thereafter. But the knowledge that Nan Madol embodies, the specific understanding of how to build in a marine environment, how to organize the logistics of large-scale stone construction in the Pacific, how to create a political and religious center that served its purposes for 300 years, this knowledge is already gone. The walls are the record of the knowledge. When the walls are gone, the record is gone. This is what makes the conservation crisis at Nan Madol matter beyond the loss of a beautiful ruin. It is the loss of the most substantial physical evidence we have for understanding a chapter of Pacific history that is not well documented in any other form. The stones know something we don't know yet. We are losing the stones. If you have made it this far, it is time to let the city carry you. There is something about Nan Madol that is particularly suited to the hours before sleep. Not just the academic mystery of it, though the mystery is real and large, but the quality of the place itself, the water, the darkness of the basalt, the isolation, the sound of the tidal surge in the stone corridors. Nan Madol is a city built for the dead. Its most important structures are the mortuary compounds. Its most carefully constructed spaces are the tombs. The dead Saudelar rulers who were buried there were believed to continue governing from their basalt houses in the ocean. The city was designed to be the interface between the living world and the world of the ancestors. This is a city that was always, in part, about sleep. The kind of sleep that does not end. The kind that the Saudelar believed continued in some form of awareness, in the stone chambers below the lagoon, in the ocean that connected them to their divine origins. The people of Pohnpei do not visit Nan Madol lightly. The site is considered deeply sacred and deeply inhabited, not by the living, but by what the living left there. The spirits of the Saudelar rulers are believed to still be present at Nan Madol. The rituals that would properly acknowledge and honor them are no longer regularly performed, but the presence is still felt. This is not superstition. This is the way that human beings relate to places where enormous amounts of human effort and human meaning have been concentrated. Nan Madol received the labor of a civilization and the faith of a dynasty in the bones of its rulers. That weight of concentrated human attention does not simply evaporate. Places hold what was given to them. Not magically, but really. Nan Madol holds what the Saudelar gave it, the ambition, the labor, the ritual attention, the bones. 3 to 4 centuries of civilization's most intense investment. 700 years of sitting in the ocean, giving back what the tide takes, holding what the tide cannot take. The basalt walls are still standing in the Pacific Ocean right now. The tidal water is moving through the canals. The mangroves are breathing in the darkness. The stars above Pohnpei are the same stars that the Saudelar navigators used to find their way home across the Pacific. The ocean is the same ocean. The city is still there. Let it carry you now, the way the canoe carries you, the way the tide carries you, the way the ocean carries everything that commits itself to it, sooner or later, one way or another. The city in the ocean is waiting. You don't need to understand it, to feel it. You just need to let the water move. Sleep now. The tide is going out. Let us return to the numbers one more time, because the numbers at Nan Madol are not merely impressive. They are, when examined carefully, genuinely impossible by the assumptions we usually bring to ancient construction. 1 million tons of basalt. That is the upper estimate for the stone at Nan Madol. For comparison, the Great Pyramid of Giza contains approximately 5.9 million tons of stone. The Great Pyramid took an estimated 20 years to build, with a workforce that some estimates place at 10,000 to 25,000 workers at its peak. The stone in the Great Pyramid was quarried nearby and transported by sledge on prepared surfaces, with the Nile River providing a transport route for some material. Nan Madol contains roughly 1/6 the stone of the Great Pyramid. But Nan Madol's stone was transported across open ocean, without the Nile, without prepared surfaces, without the logistical infrastructure of the most organized state in the ancient world. The workforce available to the Saudelar on Pohnpei was the population of a small Pacific island group, perhaps 10,000 to 30,000 people in total, including children, elders, and the people who needed to grow the food that everyone else ate. The math does not work comfortably. When archaeologists have modeled the construction, the estimates of labor required come out somewhere between plausible and impossible, depending on the assumptions you make about workforce size, working hours, transport efficiency, and the duration of the construction period. The most optimistic models, with the most favorable assumptions about workforce size and efficiency, suggest that the construction was possible, but would have required the majority of the adult population of Pohnpei to be engaged in construction-related work for most of the construction period. This would leave minimal labor for food production, and a society that devotes most of its adult labor to construction will quickly run out of food. The less optimistic models, with more conservative assumptions, produce estimates that exceed the available labor supply, even under the most generous assumptions about construction duration. There are two possible conclusions. The first is that our assumptions about the construction timeline, the workforce size, or the construction techniques are wrong in ways that resolve the apparent impossibility. Perhaps the construction took much longer than the oral tradition suggests. Perhaps the workforce was larger, drawn from a wider regional network than the local Pohnpei population alone implies. Perhaps there are construction techniques for moving and placing the largest stones that we have not identified and that were significantly more efficient than anything our models assume. Any of these could resolve the apparent impossibility. None has been demonstrated conclusively. The second possible conclusion is that the apparent impossibility is real, that Nan Madol was built by a process that we do not understand, that the Pohnpei and oral tradition's recourse to magic, to flying stones and divine founders, reflects not ignorance, but the honest account of people who witnessed a process that exceeded normal human capability. This second conclusion is the one that careful examination of the numbers makes harder to dismiss than it initially appears. The stones are there. The math is difficult. The explanation is missing. Somewhere in that gap between what the stones demonstrate and what the math allows and what the explanation provides is the real story of Nan Madol. We don't have it yet. What do you take from Nan Madol? Not the mystery, though the mystery is real and probably permanent. Not the archaeology, though the archaeology is genuinely interesting. Not the legend, though the legend is worth keeping in mind as a pointer toward genuine wonder. What you take from Nan Madol is a recalibration of what you thought was possible for human beings in pre-modern contexts. We live in an era that tends to understand human history as a story of progressive development, from simple to complex, from limited to capable, from ignorant to knowing. In this story, ancient people were less capable than modern people, their societies less sophisticated, their achievements more limited. Nan Madol disrupts this story, not because it requires supernatural explanation, but because it demonstrates, in basalt and ocean, that human beings in the 13th century Pacific were capable of organizational, logistical, and engineering achievements whose precise mechanisms we in the 21st century cannot fully explain. This should be humbling and liberating. Humbling, because it means that the story of human capability is not a simple upward slope. There were peaks in the past that we have not reached from our side yet. There were things known in specific places at specific times that are genuinely lost. The builders of Nan Madol knew something about moving stone through the open ocean that we do not know. Liberating, because it means that the limits we tend to impose on what past humans could achieve are our limits, not theirs. When we ask how this was possible and find no comfortable answer, the discomfort is our failure of imagination, not their failure of capability. There is also something in Nan Madol about the relationship between power and place. The Saudeleur chose the most difficult possible location for their capital, and then built the most impressive possible city there. Not despite the difficulty, but through the difficulty, making the difficulty itself the demonstration of their power. The ocean was not overcome. It was inhabited. This is a different relationship with the natural world than the one Western modernity tends to celebrate, the relationship of conquest and mastery. The Saudeleur did not conquer the ocean. They moved into it. They built their city in it and let it move through their walls, and accepted the tidal rhythm as the rhythm of their city. Their power came from inhabiting the most difficult environment rather than from controlling it. This is a model of power that the Pacific Ocean has been teaching, in various ways, to the various peoples who have lived on and around it for thousands of years. You do not master the ocean. You learn to move with it, to use its power rather than oppose it, to find the lines of least resistance that allow you to go where you need to go. The Saudeleur applied this principle to stone construction. They built with the ocean rather than against it. The tidal canals were not a concession to the water. They were the design. The flooding and draining were not problems to be solved. They were the rhythm the city lived by. In this sense, Nan Madol is not just an archaeological mystery. It is a lesson in a different way of being powerful. Build in the hardest place. Let the hardest place become your strength. Make the impossibility the point. The ocean is still there. The walls are still standing. The lesson is still available. The last person to live permanently at Nan Madol left, we believe, sometime in the 17th century. We do not know their name. We do not know whether they left voluntarily or were moved away by the new political authorities. We do not know whether they looked back. We know that when they left, they extinguished whatever fires they had burning, took whatever was portable and valuable, and paddled away from the basalt walls, through the canal network, and out through the breakwater gap and into the lagoon of Pohnpei. The walls stood behind them. The tidal water moved through the canals, as it had always moved. The stars above the city were the same stars that had been above it when Olisishpa and Olosopa arrived to begin the building. The Pacific constellations that had guided the founders from their distant homeland, that had oriented the subtler rulers in their position at the center of the ocean world. The city did not know it had been abandoned. Cities don't know things. But if you believe, as the people of Pohnpei have always believed, that the spirits of the Saudeleur rulers remain in their basalt tombs in the mortuary compounds of Nan Duis, then the city is not, in the most important sense, abandoned at all. The dead are still there. The founders are still there. The ocean is still there. The basalt is still there. What left was the living. What remained was everything else. And what remained is still there, right now, in the tidal night of the Pohnpei lagoon, the walls rising from the water, the canals filling and emptying with the tide, the mangroves breathing in the darkness, the stars above the open Pacific, the same stars that guided the founders to this particular reef, on this particular island, to build the most unlikely city in the history of the ocean. Somewhere below the ruins, in the ocean floor that the magnetic anomaly surveys hinted at but no one has excavated, there may be more. The earlier foundations, the older city, the submerged record of what came before the Saudeleur. We haven't looked yet. This is perhaps the strangest thing about Nan Madol. Not that it exists, not that it was built by people we don't fully understand, using methods we can't fully explain, in a place that makes no practical sense. All of that is strange enough. The strangest thing is that it is there, 700 years old, built by one of the most remarkable civilizations in the history of the Pacific, sitting in the middle of the ocean, and we have barely looked at it. The ocean has been keeping the secret in plain sight. The water moves through the stone holds, the secret waits. Go to sleep now. The tide is going out at Nan Madol. The basalt walls are standing in the dark. The tidal water is moving through the corridors where the Saudeleur lords once paddled their canoes. The mangroves are quiet. The Pacific stars are bright above the lagoon. The city built in the middle of the ocean is still there. It was there last night. It will be there in the morning. The ocean does not forget what it has been given. Good night. Nan Madol is the largest and most famous ruin in Micronesia, but it is not the only one. Understanding it alongside the other remarkable constructions of the region helps place it in its proper frame not as an isolated miracle, but as the supreme expression of a civilization that was doing extraordinary things across an enormous stretch of ocean. Lalu, on the island of Kozre, approximately 350 miles to the east of Pohnpei, is Nan Madol's closest architectural relative. It shares so many features: artificial islands built in shallow coastal water, walls of stacked columnar basalt, a canal network as the primary circulatory system of the city, a separation between sacred and residential zones, that any account of one site must reckon with the existence of the other. Leilu was the capital of the chiefs of Cosray for several centuries. Its construction is generally dated to roughly the same period as the peak of Nan Madol, the 13th and 14th centuries, though some elements may be earlier. The walls at Leilu are, in places, even more precisely constructed than those at Nan Madol. The basalt columns are fitted with a care that approaches masonry in the most exacting sense of the word. Surfaces matched and corners squared with a precision that could only be achieved by experienced specialists working under close supervision. The existence of Leilu raises a question that has not been definitively answered. Which came first? Was Leilu a colony of Nan Madol's tradition, built by people who had learned from or been sent from the Saudeleur capital? Was Nan Madol influenced by an earlier tradition at Cosray? Or did both sites independently develop similar solutions to the specific challenges of building a prestigious political capital in a Micronesian marine environment? The oral traditions of both islands speak of connections and of conflict. The Iso-Kelikel story, which describes the liberator of Pohnpei from Saudeleur rule as coming specifically from Cosray, suggests a long relationship between the two islands that included both cultural exchange and political rivalry. Iso-Kelikel bringing warriors from Cosray to overthrow the Saudeleur may also have been bringing, in some sense, a competing architectural and political tradition to assert itself over the Pohnpeian one. After Iso-Kelikel's victory, what was built? Not another Nan Madol. The Nan Varki system that replaced Saudeleur ruled distributed power rather than concentrating it, and distributed power does not build concentrated monuments. The ambition that produced Nan Madol required the specific combination of centralized authority, coerced labor, and cosmological conviction that the Saudeleur embodied. When that combination ended, the city ended, and no equivalent was built anywhere in Micronesia afterward. This tells us something important. Nan Madol was not the inevitable product of a building tradition that would have produced it sooner or later, regardless of political circumstances. It was the product of a specific historical moment, a specific dynasty with a specific ideology of centralized divine authority, in a specific natural environment that happened to provide the raw material for construction, governing a specific regional network that could provide the labor. Change any of those elements, and the city does not get built. History is full of this kind of contingency. The things that seem inevitable in retrospect were possible only in a narrow window of conditions that happened to align. The Great Pyramid required the specific combination of the Old Kingdom's political organization, Egypt's geography, and the technological moment of the Pyramid Age. Change the dynasty or the flood cycle or the availability of skilled workers or any of a dozen other factors, and the pyramid is not built. Nan Madol required the Saudeleur. The Saudeleur happened to exist in this particular lagoon, with this particular cosmology, at this particular moment in Pacific history. And so, the city exists. And so we are still talking about it 700 years after the last Saudeleur ruled from its basalt walls. The other ruins of Micronesia, the stone platforms on Yap, the ancient paths and stone money banks of the Caroline Islands, the fish traps and agricultural terraces on Palau speak of a region-wide tradition of monumental construction that Nan Madol represents at its most extreme. But even the more modest monuments of the region, when examined, reveal a level of organizational sophistication and architectural ambition that the historical record of the Pacific has chronically underestimated. The Pacific Island civilizations were not simple. They were complex, hierarchical, technically sophisticated, and capable of impressive things. Nan Madol is the proof in the most literal sense of the word, the physical evidence that cannot be argued away, sitting in the ocean, in basalt, where it has been for 700 years. Look at the walls. Look at the canals. Look at the scale. Then reconsider what you thought you knew about the ancient Pacific. There is a biological drama happening at Nan Madol that most visitors do not notice, and that the conservation reports discuss in technical language that tends to obscure its fundamental strangeness. The coral reef on which Nan Madol was built is alive. Not in the way it was alive when the Sodeler first laid their foundations on it. 700 years of construction, habitation, and subsequent abandonment have changed the reef community profoundly. The physical disturbance of the original construction buried and smothered large areas of living coral. The runoff from the artificial islands altered the water chemistry of the shallow lagoon. The canals, by channeling tidal flow in new directions, changed the patterns of sediment deposition across the reef. But the reef adapted. Reefs do, given time. They colonize available substrate and restore something like their original character, though never exactly the same. The basalt walls of Nan Madol, which the reef's original inhabitants would have experienced as a catastrophic disturbance, have become, over centuries, excellent coral habitat. The rough surface of the basalt provides attachment points for coral larvae. The walls create the current shadows and depth variations that different coral species prefer. The channels between the artificial islands provide the water circulation that reef communities need. Today, the underwater portions of Nan Madol's foundations are coated in living coral. Fish patrol the basalt corridors. The same walls that the Sodeler built as political monuments have become, in the centuries since the dynasty ended, a reef ecosystem. The distinction between the human-made structure and the natural structure has been thoroughly blurred by 700 years of biological colonization. This is a form of integration that the Sodeler did not plan, but that fits, in its way, perfectly with the cosmology that motivated the city's construction. The ocean was always the medium in which the city existed. The city always breathed with the ocean's tides. The coral growing on the foundations is simply the ocean's final assertion of its relationship with the stone. Not destroying it, not replacing it, but integrating it, making it part of the reef in the same way that the reef was always part of the city. The Sodeler built in the ocean built on the Sodeler. The fish that move through the basalt corridors at depth are navigating the same spatial network that the Sodeler canoes once navigated at the surface. The topography of the underwater city is the topography of the living reef. The human and the natural have become, in 7 centuries, a single system. Underwater archaeology at the site, limited as it has been, reveals this integration in striking visual terms. A diver moving along the base of a Nan Madol wall sees basalt columns, the same dark gray columns that are visible above the waterline encrusted with coral. The coral itself, in turn hosting the small creatures of the reef, nudibranchs, anemones, small fish hovering in the current shadows. The wall that a Sodeler noble once looked up at from his canoe is now a garden, tended not by human hands, but by the slow, patient cultivation of the sea. There is something the Sodeler knew about the relationship between human construction and the natural world that this biological integration makes visible. They did not build against the reef. They built on it, in it, with it. The tidal water they welcomed into their canals brought the nutrients that sustained the reef, that sustained the fish, that sustained the people. The construction was part of a system, not an imposition on one. The coral does not distinguish between the Sodeler's basalt and the reef's original limestone. Both are substrate. Both are home. The city and the reef have been one organism for longer than the city was ever a city. This, too, is what Nan Madol is. The Pacific Ocean at night around Pohnpei is not what most people imagine when they imagine night. It is not dark in the way that cities are dark, cut through by artificial light and never fully surrendering to the absence of the sun. It is not even dark in the way that rural landscapes are dark, where the darkness is merely the absence of light and the shapes of familiar things are still present in outline. The Pacific at night, on a clear night, far from any city, is something else. The sky is so full of stars that the darkness is merely the space between them. The Milky Way is not a suggestion or a faint glow. It is a structure, a band of light dense enough to cast shadows on clear water. The light from the stars falls on the lagoon at Nan Madol. It falls on the basalt walls rising from the water, on the mangrove canopies, on the tidal water in the canals. The ruins glow faintly in the starlight, the dark stone catching the ancient light from across the galaxy. The same stars that the Southerner navigators used to cross the Pacific fall on the city those navigators built. The stars do not know the city is a ruin. The stars do not know the dynasty is gone. The stars are doing what they have always done, burning and shining and providing light to anyone and anything below them that happens to be out in the dark. The tidal water is moving through the basalt corridors, in and out, with the slow breath of the ocean, the same rhythm the ocean has kept since before the Southerner, since before Pohnpei was inhabited, since before the first canoe crossed the Pacific. The city breathes with the ocean. The city has always breathed with the ocean. In the morning, if you were there, the light would come from the east, touching the tops of the basalt walls before it touched the water in the canals. The birds that roost in the mangroves would begin their noise. The tidal water would be at its morning level, whatever the tide brought in the night, and the walls would still be standing as they have stood every morning for 700 years. The Southerner are gone. The ocean is still there. The city is still between them. That is enough. Sleep well.